Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Vermont businessman, civic leader, and author Bill Schubart took up writing in his retirement, and we are richer for it. In his 9 books and hundreds of opinion pieces, Schubart has offered us everything from poignant tales of his childhood in Vermont to biting social commentary. An entrepreneur from an early age, he co-founded a recording company, followed by the co-founding of a media business. As a community leader, he served as chair of the Vermont Business Roundtable, among over a dozen other chairmanships. Thank you, Bill Schubart, for joining us today. It's so nice to have you with us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, Fran. I'm honored to be on this show, which I've watched for I don't know how many years on and off.
Well, it's been on for quite a while. And one of the things we look at is Vermont and what it means to be a Vermonter, and certainly Vermont identity is being talked a lot about these days. You were brought up in Morrisville, but you also have this familial connection to high culture in New York City, and you write about Vermont all the time. What is a Vermonter to you?
Well, it's interesting. I don't think everybody's going to be pleased with my answer because the typical answer is they've lived in Vermont for 7 generations. The family probably farmed. And frankly, as someone who's lived here since 1947, I can't imagine a more exclusionary definition of a Vermonter. How about something like this? It's somebody who moved to Vermont, doesn't matter when. They moved here because they value our culture, our communities, our people, and our environment. And they've come here to join that, not to make it over like where they came from, but to become part of our communities. That to me is a real Vermonter.
Okay, thank you, Bill. And your storytelling is very rich, and so much of it grounded in Vermont. Why was it important to you to tell the Lamoille Stories? You have 2 volumes of these stories, and the absorbing, of course, Lila and Theron.
Well, the Lamoille Stories have been haunting me for a long time, and when I was a businessman, I never really had time to sit down and write them. But our family, especially the French Canadian side, was just filled with stories. I mean, we'd go to dinner on Sunday afternoon, and Uncle Mendoza would tell some story half in French and half in English, or Grammy Couture would, or, someone else would. And those stories just stayed with me. And I just felt like it became important, to write them down. And it was interesting because when I wrote the book, I was very conscious of not embarrassing anybody because they were really true stories. So I was changing all these names and everything. And then I go over to Morrisville Library, to do a reading, and I'm absolutely terrified. And this one very large woman gets up before I even start, and she goes, "Billy Couture, I know every damn person in that book." And I absolutely panicked. But it was great fun. And I finally came to realize that no matter how people were painted in those stories, they were happy to be in them. So it all worked out fine. And Lila and Theron was the farm family who lived next to us. Mr. Farr gave me my first job when I was 12 years old with his cows. And, they were a couple that I just absolutely revered.
Yeah, and it's just such a beautiful story. It was a short story, and then you expanded it into a beautiful book. And I want to get to your most recent book. You took Dante's Inferno and modernized it to reflect the sins of our time, this time. What inspired that journey and the book called The Correctional Facility?
The honest answer is terror. Having been, raised as a very traditional Catholic and going to catechism every Sunday and listening to the Quebecois nuns who came down from Quebec to teach catechism, we were imbued with a sense of how horrific hell is. And then when I went away to school, when I was 13, I read Dante's Inferno, and it confirmed everything I learned in catechism. And then over the years, that sort of very haunting, if you do this, you're going to burn for eternity in hell. Um, just, I couldn't get it out of my system. And I tried to write about it. And that's how the correctional facility came out. And it was really more of an exploration of how the concept of sin has changed in 700 years. Sins that were existed in Dante's time are not sins anymore. But
Right.
we've invented new sins.
Yeah, like bigotry and sexual aggression and of course
Yeah.
greed, but different things that you're really exploring. And instead of Virgil, you have Whitman. It's just a really interesting exploration
Well,
of,
thank you.
of that whole scene. And to me, one of your most touching books is Fat People. It acquaints readers with the fears, the joys, and the sorrows of people who will read, written with compassion and humor. These are fictional stories, but poignantly real. Tell us about the space that you filled by writing this book. It was unusual.
Well, like all fiction, they're based in reality and in real experience. And the stories are deeply disguised, obviously, in their fictional form, but many of them relate to real people I knew. I needed, I actually weighed 485 pounds at my largest and didn't ever fully understand why. I've always struggled with weight. Went into a treatment facility, um, very funky place, lost 240 pounds very safely over 2 years, realized that I had really been addicted to refined carbohydrates. And I wanted to write a book that engendered empathy for people whose best friend and worst enemy is food. And I didn't want to write a diet book. I didn't want to offer solutions. I didn't want any miracle stuff. I just wanted people to be able to read stories to understand the nature of food addiction and eating disorders. So it's much more about empathy.
Right, and really sharing those stories. So let's move on to leadership. There are many more books we can discuss, but we'll move on to leadership. You have been chairman of over a dozen boards and a director of really many more. There are over 6,000 nonprofits in Vermont. I think it's something like 20% of our economy. And you've written about your concern that many boards really don't know how nonprofit governance works. What is a board of directors' responsibility?
Well, it's remarkably simple. I mean, people tend to think that governance is a very complicated and sophisticated art. The reality is, a board of directors of a nonprofit is legally responsible for the ethical, financial, and integrity of the organization, as well as delivery on mission. Probably one of the most important things that they do is to hire, compensate, and review the performance of an executive director. And that, frankly, is the failing of a lot of organizations. First of all, sometimes the board members are chosen by the executive director. So, how good are they going to be at doing an honest performance review? That's one issue. The other issue is they say, oh, she's a lovely person or he's a wonderful guy. We don't need to do that nonsense. They're doing a great job. Well, that's true until it isn't true. And when it isn't true, it's on the board. If an organization goes down, either ethically or financially, it's not the president or the executive director that the law comes after, it's the board. The board is responsible, and boards don't fully understand that.
Right, because many of them are volunteer boards, and it's hard to
Yeah,
take on that responsibility, but
that's right.
that's very important. So among this, you've been very involved in leadership, so you've also been a longtime commentator because you're involved in so many things. You've been a commentator for VPR, and currently you have a biweekly column published in VT Digger. You take on very difficult topics: corrections, healthcare, education, and much more. And as a social critic, you've encountered backlash. Is this a recent phenomenon? Has the tone surprised you? How have you responded?
In general, no. At 76, it's not all about me. It's about how can I contribute to a discussion? How can I take a complicated topic like healthcare, which is incomprehensible even to people in healthcare, um, and how can I make it generally understandable? And how can I raise issues without further polarizing the discussion? I work really hard to try and do that, and it's not always easy. Sometimes, 1,000 word column will take me 6 or 8 hours because you have to do your own fact checking and so on and so forth. Anyway,
Yeah.
I generally get pretty positive feedback. I've got about 1,500 people who have opted in to get them, and every once in a while, I get the grenade, over the 10-foot fence anonymously from a troll. And but it's remarkably rare. And when I do,
Yes.
if I know who they are, I write them back. And I often say, hey, how about a cup of coffee?
Great. So we're almost out of time, Bill, and as a thoughtful and thought-provoking social critic, what are you most concerned about during this moment in time?
I'm most concerned about the slow disappearance of journalism.
Mm.
That's terrifying to me. As the Atlantic calls it, the journalism deserts popping up, the financial interests buying up the major papers and asset stripping them. That scares me. And the slow, almost metastatic, almost invisible erosion of democracy. Those are the two things that really terrify me.
Okay. Bill Schubart, we've just barely tapped the surface of what you can share with us today. I'm so glad to have you on our program, and our viewers can find out much more about you and your work at Schubart, www.schubart.com. Thank you, Bill Schubart, so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Terrific, me too. And once again, thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.